Okay, uh, thanks a lot. Thanks for everybody. I hear there's quite a lot of students on the program and dairy farmers and the wide, varied lot of people. So I'm going to try and stick to principles during this talk because biosecurity is such a big word. And I think for that reason, a lot of people don't really put biosecurity plans into place. Um, most of my work, I must say, 90% of my work is basically in beef cattle. My interest in dairy farms is in specific aspects, but dairy farms being more intensive than beef farms, biosecurity is much more of importance. Elaine, can I just ask, is the sound coming through well?
Sound is perfect and the screen is excellent.
Okay. So if we look at biosecurity, we always have pictures about something like a prison and everything inside is protected. We do see that in the pig industry, in the swine industry, as well as in the chicken industry. But we work with properties that's not so easy to have that same type of biosecurity than our totally intensive industries. In our intensive industries, we control two things to a large extent, really 100%. And the one is the housing, and the other one is the food. So when we go to extensive units, production units, we don't have total control about housing and about food. Especially now, the dairy industry, to a very large extent, is on grazing. The full feed farms are becoming less. There's still a lot of them. They have more control because the cattle stay close to a certain area. But in dairy farms on grazing, we have less control, and we're also very dependent on environmental conditions. So as veterinarians, we very used to emergency services. I work mostly with most of the livestock veterinarians throughout the country. And our business model that we have developed 50 years ago, and it's still going and providing work for 90% plus of the veterinarians, is basically the business model where you have a crisis on a farm, a disease crisis. A farmer calls you out and you handle that crisis as good as you can. And you also assist that farmer with reproductive work. Biosecurity and herd health to very large haven't been developed like we've developed our clinical or emergency services. Because herd health, and I'll take you through this whole presentation, there's a lot of methodology. There's a lot of methodology that need to be followed, unlike with when we do emergency cases, we do whatever is in front of us with what products we have. When we talk about herd health and then biosecurity, which is a bigger concept, there's a lot of methodology behind that. So that's the first thing that we have to understand, that there's a lot of methodology and we can't just approach it as we approach our clinical service. So the definition is very simple, and there's a lot of definitions in different books, but it comes back to the three basic activities when we talk about biosecurity. The first one is to prevent disease-causing organisms. Organisms, factors, any biological thing, but it can also be abiotic. Prevent them from getting onto the farm and causing disease or production loss. So that's the first step. And we always have to keep that step in mind when we come later in prevention of certain of the diseases that can cause havoc on a dairy farm. Then the second part is basically containing a disease once it gets onto the farm. And containment is a big word, biocontainment, but in actual fact, that is our whole herd health plan. Our whole herd health plan is there to increase the resistance against diseases that if they come onto the farm, it don't spread or run through the herd very quickly, or we have specific treatments, early identification and treatments of certain diseases. But the second part is our herd health plan, and then the third part of this biosecurity is basically anything that leave the farm, and that's in the form of live animals and products from our livestock like milk. Anything that leave the farm, not to infect other farms and or a consumer. So biosecurity is basically this 3 steps. And we spend as vets at least a lot of our time on the herd health plan, and I'm going to use the herd health plan and some examples in that as part of biosecurity, because it's not divorced from biosecurity, it's part of this whole plan. So we basically have just 2 approaches or tools, whatever you want to name it, that we can use either in combination or as single tools to prevent diseases. And that's not only diseases coming onto the farm, that's diseases that's on the farm already. And that's what we're talking about, the herd health plan. So preventing them from getting onto the farm and or preventing them from spreading within the herd. So our first approach or tool is to increase the animal's general and specific resistance to disease-causing organisms. So here we talk about the 2 levels of immunity, the innate immunity and the immunity that we can develop after exposing animals to a specific antigen. So the innate immunity and general resistance is basically against many diseases and not that specific. But it depends on our other good management practices that we follow. The good nutrition, for one, if we want to have good innate immunity, nutrition must be optimal. And you spoke a lot about nutrition today and even mineral nutrition. But our protein, energy, minerals must be optimal to have good immunity or resistance, non-specific against diseases. Secondly, parasite control. That's part of building good immunity. Parasite control, we see in many cases and less in dairy cattle, but to a very large extent in beef cattle, that a heavy tick burden can cause a lowering of the immune system and making the animals very susceptible, not only to tick-borne diseases, but to other diseases. Stress, decreasing stress during critical periods. In the case of the dairy cow, the period after calving, when she's very under stress. So this good management practices is not only to maintain production, but it's also there to basically make sure that the immune system is optimal and working, especially in a non-specific immune system. And then we're getting closer and closer to this point where we also will genetically select for disease resistance. There's even dairy farmers that use a certain breed and saying this breed have better resistance against mastitis or development of mastitis. So that is all part of the whole innate immune system. It's looking after the immune system in order to have a non-specific handling of disease-causing organisms that on a daily basis. And then we come to the second part of this first tool, and that's our specific immunity. Immunity that we get when we specifically expose the immune system to a individual antigen, and this immunity
Okay, I don't know whether you can't or whether there's sound, but the sound stopped on my side. So I'm just going to make contact with Dr. Danie, okay?
Good. En dan kan julle my nou hoor.
Yes, we can hear you. So everybody, we will start again. Welcome back, Dr. Danie.
Okay, sorry. I initially wanted to say technology is such a wonderful thing. I can sit here in my slippers and talk to you, and then suddenly the computers decided to restart for the first time ever. So there's always some snag. Anyway, so we have got whatever we do in biosecurity, disease prevention, and herd health. The two main tools. The first one is the increase and specific resistance. We've worked through general resistance and the things that have effect on that, and what we call innate immunity, and then specific resistance or immunity specifically, where we stimulate the immunity either through vaccination or natural exposure. We must understand there's always natural exposure. In certain places, animals get raised to build up natural exposure against anaplasmosis, for instance, or African redwater. There's very few herds that always vaccinate against those diseases, and calves get exposed in many cases before 6 months. So both those legs of specific immunity is of importance, vaccination as well as natural exposure. And we've seen now in these days, with all the discussions about the disease in the humans, that actually we get to understand that people understand very little about the basics of immunology and the development of the immune process. The basics there, and it's an oversimplification, is just the 2 weeks that it takes for a new antigen that's been given to an animal, a totally naive animal, where it takes 2 weeks for that animal or the immune system of that animal to produce protective immunity, either in the form of antibodies or activated T cells, and then also to form memory cells. But on the other hand, when we look at immediate protection while we're using a booster dose, the whole picture change. We get protective immunity within 2 days. And there's something that we sometimes forget in our herd health plans, that there's a major difference between a naive animal and an animal that's been vaccinated before that have memory cells. But anyway, so that's the one leg, and that is to increase resistance. The other leg of the whole equation is to decrease exposure. Sorry, let me just see the thing. So the other side of the coin is basically to reduce, and that's a level of reduction, or totally avoid exposure to the disease-causing organisms. And in certain cases, it's good enough to reduce, but in other cases, we have to totally prevent exposure. And we will look at different examples where that come into play. So that requires specific management actions. And that is where biosecurity and the biggest part of biosecurity come into the role, where we have to reduce or avoid exposure. Now, reducing exposure, there's a lot of different ways of doing that. One of the things that we know is culling animals that is carriers of a disease like brucellosis. If you don't do that, don't matter what else you do on that farm to try and maintain or manage that disease, you can't. You have to cull out the carriers. You have to reduce the exposure to naive animals in future. Early identification and treatment of sick animals, yeah, that's where we as vets normally are good at and come in and work with the farmer. And that is to that index case to treat that animal early, especially in something that is going to cause the disease to spread to other animals within the herd, like we see a lot with eye infections, especially now, even during the winter. There's less flies, but there's more dust and factors that make the eye more susceptible. And then early warnings of disease problems, of outbreaks. So as veterinarian network, we've developed a whole system, and I think most of your students know about that, where the veterinarians, the livestock veterinarians, report their diseases to me on a monthly basis, and we can see where do we get new diseases, new trends, diseases that didn't happen in that area before, or an outbreak of a disease that we know very well that sometimes don't occur every year. One of the things last year we were very, very worried about, especially in the dairy industry, was Rift Valley fever, because we know that the previous outbreak was 11 years ago, and we also know that very few farmers kept on vaccinating the animals. So they sit with a lot of naive animals. So if they were still vaccinating the heifers, they were not naive, and you can deal with that. But if you have total naive herds right through the country, you have got big problems. So that's the reduction of exposure. And then there's avoidance, total prevention of exposure. So that's the other important part, and that's for diseases for which we don't have any treatment or vaccination. The most important one in the dairy industry is bovine tuberculosis, for which we don't have any treatment and or any vaccination. So that type of disease can only be prevented in a biosecurity setup by totally avoidance of exposure. Such an animal must never get onto the farm. Very, very straightforward and simple. So part of this avoidance of exposure is then our perimeter fences, our quarantine facilities, and control of traffic on the farm. And we'll come back to those measures. So just in summary, we have the two tools, either to increase resistance or to reduce exposure. So basically everything that we do in herd health and or in biosecurity revolve around these two tools or approaches, and we use combination depending on the different diseases that we have to deal with. So just a quick look back at general resistance, and we know that in any biological population, there's a number of animals that have inherent disease resistance, and when we have an outbreak, we don't get 100% of animals dying, except if we deal like with African swine fever, which is a very big crisis. But there's usually animals that have some form of natural resistance and some that's more susceptible, and we have this classical bell curve that we always, and especially the graph in the bottom, where we have a cumulative number of animals being either susceptible or immune or resistant against the disease, that we can put figures to what do this bell curve mean. So we have the one tool, and that is to prevent exposure. So this is just to show again what happened to a normal population where we increase exposure and or where the animal's disease resistance, our innate immunity, that first leg of our thing, is lowered. So it moved the median down to one side, and in the bottom you can see what it do to the number of animals now susceptible, the cumulative number of animals being susceptible. either increase in exposure, so you buy a number of cows in that is BVD carriers, or on the other hand, you have a nutritional problem, metabolic or a mineral deficiency, and you decrease resistance. So there's a equal or a large change in the susceptibility in that herd. So what we do normally by increasing specific resistance, when we vaccinate the herd for specific disease, say for instance, lumpy skin disease, we move the whole herd to the right-hand side of that median, and there will still be a few individual or percentage of animals that's susceptible. And the reason why they're still susceptible is there is just a percentage of animals in a herd that don't have a competent immune system, which don't produce a protective immunity. In certain diseases, it's very low. The vaccine will nearly work 100%. And we know that with vaccines like our anthrax, our live attenuated anthrax, which is incredibly, I've never seen anthrax in cattle being vaccinated before, even in areas where it occurred. When I was working in next to the Kruger Park some 30 odd years ago. And then we have other diseases where the vaccine is not that antigenic. And three-day stiffness come here to mind, where the type of organism that we use, the modified live, is not that antigenic. And there's still 5 or 10% of the animals that's affected, and you have to give a booster dose to basically shift that resistant animals curve further to the right. But you can still see in the bottom graph there, the number of animals in a vaccinated herd, depending on the type of disease that you want to control, is so small in comparison with the non-vaccinated herd. So that is what happened when we do vaccination. But even in those vaccinated animals, if there's a major increase in challenge, it will still move the median line again further to the right, and there will be more animals susceptible, but still in relation to a non-vaccinated herd, much less if you look at the bottom graph. And that is just what I wanted to portray here. I don't have much time to go into every one like that. So when we do disease prevention strategies and all specifically biosecurity, we're looking at using tools together in combination by increasing general resistance, increasing specific resistance, and decreasing exposure. That is when you really move the graph to the left-hand side. And for certain diseases to be able to control them, that's what's necessary. And this is just, again, an example to make it visible. How do we do that when we use all those tools that we have together? And like I said at the start, and we use Staphylococcus aureus here as the example, because it's an incredibly difficult organism to deal with, to manage, and to eradicate, for that instance, if you can do it. But just to manage it, nowadays we do have some part of vaccinations that can help us, so we can decrease or increase specific resistance. We do have good nutrition to also do that, and decreasing exposure in this case mean identifying and culling those animals that's the carriers of the disease. So I hope if we try to portray with the specific graphs. And then lastly, we have some diseases, like I said, where we don't have an available vaccine. That's foot and mouth disease as an example. There's a vaccine by the state in certain areas, but we're not allowed to use that in the open areas, which is not infected areas. And the only single way of dealing with that disease is to make sure that there's no exposure. So you must prevent exposure 100%, and it's the same with brucellosis. So what we do then, we divide the diseases up into this type of overview and say, how do we manage and control certain diseases, either by increasing of immunity or by decreasing of exposure. So the first thing that a vet do on a farm when they do the herd health program, he tried to manage in the program the things that is totally manageable, the things that you can totally, and I say exclude, but you see the grass before you never totally exclude something. We still work with the biological system. But as an example, on the left-hand top corner, if we look at lumpy skin disease as a crisis, we can, to a very large extent, in all the herds that we never get lumpy skin disease due to our vaccination program. Rift Valley fever is one that can be excluded if we do vaccinations in the heifers and follow up when we have an outbreak in the country. I'm not going to go into every single disease. 3-day stiffness, which was this year a major crisis in our cattle industry, more so in the beef industry in the summer rainfall areas, less so in the dairy areas, but major losses in certain areas. And it can be prevented, but like I said before, you have to understand the disease, you have to understand the vaccine. This is a low antigenic vaccine. You need to have 2 doses when you treat or vaccinate a naive animal before you get good protection, and then on a yearly basis. If you take the bacterial diseases that cause acute deaths, blackwater, botulism, anthrax, all 3 of those can nearly be 100% prevented by vaccination. Because the first 2, blackwater and botulism, is an inactivated toxoid vaccine, and we have to understand the vaccines. It will produce antibodies, which will be at a high level for a certain period of time. We work it out on 1 year, and then it will go down, and there won't be protection if we don't revaccinate. So there's also the rules with each vaccine. Some of them will give lifelong immunity. If we give lumpy skin twice and then maybe a third time, that animal will have very permanent immunity. But with our Clostridial toxoid vaccines, it's different. The biggest crisis, what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is brucellosis. And you'll see brucellosis in South Africa, which is the state-controlled disease that's basically out of control. And we'll go into detail with that. And for the dairy industry, it still is the #1 priority or disease that must be prioritized because of the 2 factors. The first is the incredible effect on abortions, and we need cows that calve normally in order to produce milk, apart from the spreading of the disease through the herd. But on the other hand, as a zoonosis. This is the disease that can be a big problem for the dairy industry. And as we will see a little bit later when I talk about it, so far we are quite lucky that our main dairy areas in the Western Cape, parts of the Eastern Cape and KZN have low levels of brucellosis versus the rest of the country, like the Free State and north, which is absolute crisis. But you see where it lies on this graph. It's basically on the right-hand side on top. That means we need to use every tool that we have to increase immunity against this disease. It also means that we have to use every tool that we have to decrease exposure against this disease. This disease, the only way that it can be managed, kept off the farm, make sure that it don't spread through the herd when it get onto the farm, is to use the maximum tools that we have to increase immunity and to decrease exposure. So the areas where we farm off grazing, where there's currently low levels of brucellosis, a number of those farmers have stopped vaccinating their heifer calves. And then when suddenly the disease appeared on a neighbor's farm, they were in a big crisis because they didn't do that very, very basic thing, increasing specific immunity by using the vaccination in the heifer calves and or follow up with RB51 in the year-olds and 2-year-olds. So this is how we then can, to a large extent, classify the diseases and how do we deal with them. So in Veterinary Network, we have the disease reporting program, like I said to you, where the veterinarians, and this is a veterinarian in the Midlands of KZN. I took it off last night. This is the real data of his disease reporting on a rolling average for the last 12 months. So our disease control program on a farm, we use the disease overview to see and prioritize what we need to change. How are we going to and it gives us a clear example. What the incredible thing about this recording system is that we can go back 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, we can view over a 5-year period and look at seasonalities, look at our main crises, and you can easily see where's the main crisis in this practice area. This is not for an individual farm, this is for a practice area. But that is the diseases that, and this is for dairy cattle because we report according to the species. This is specifically for dairy cattle, and you can see where major problems lie with this veterinarian. And one of the crises, I don't know if you can pick it up, you'll see in February this veterinarian didn't report. So you've lost a lot of data, a lot of picture just by not reporting that specific month that makes his disease overview complete. So on the farm, we have to deal with a lot of different diseases, and I'm not going to go into that. That's not my topic, but we must understand that the herd health plan is part of the biosecurity plan. It's not something separate. The herd health plan, and on dairy cattle, many of the diseases that we deal with, it's a type of management equilibrium, and it depends on losses, and it depends on improvement of income. And many of the diseases that we deal with on dairy cattle, we can't totally exclude, like a mastitis, like lameness. We have to deal with it at a certain level, which make it cost effective, the approach that we treat. Remember, every disease do have a cost due to the losses, but it also have a cost due to the control of that. In this specific case, if we look at mastitis, and if we have to identify one that's of importance for biosecurity, then it's our infectious causes of mastitis. The ones that we can bring into the herd with cows that we buy in. So immediately that will stand out not only as a normal herd health management plan, but also as part of our biosecurity buying in cows that is clean and are not carriers of example Staph aureus. The same for hoof diseases. The previous speaker spoke about that. Hoof diseases, maybe you think that is not that important, but then there's one or two that can be a biosecurity risk. We've seen in the dairy herds, especially in the coastal areas, where this disease, the digital dermatitis, were brought into those herds. And it became a major crisis on top of the normal lameness, causes of lameness that they have to deal with. So now we have identified two main priorities already, where we can look at biosecurity in dairy cattle, and that is one, infectious mastitis and infectious lameness dermatitis. Just going back to our approach in either herd health and or biosecurity, we always have to make sure that we look at the whole disease. You know, in clinical medicine, emergency medicine, we're there and we do whatever we can do with the products that we have in our case. But when we deal with planned herd health, we break down every disease that we deal with into the cause, what is the type of cause organism, the distribution, how is it transmitted, which animals, age group or species do it affect, when do it occur, and then by very, very specifically, the disease development process, the pathogenesis, to understand from a herd health point of view and or a biosecurity point of view, where can we prevent this disease? And that is why in our methodology in disease prevention, we go back to everything that you've learned at vet school, and we go and see where do things occur, where they need to be treated or prevented. It's different than the clinical approach where you wait for the signs of disease. We monitor and treat whenever we suspect that it's going to be a problem. I can just show you a simple example of through the herd disease monitoring. When we look at liver fluke, we see that same herd that I showed you previously, the whole overview of the herd. Here we see liver fluke. Every year in June, there's a few adult cows dying, and when we do the postmortems, there's the adult flukes in the liver. Now again, we take all our knowledge of a disease, the organism, the transmission, and the disease development process, and we're going to look and see where do this thing happen, how do we prevent it, at what stage. And for that, we need the knowledge, everything that you've learned, but put into perspective to understand precisely that transmission of liver fluke. Where do it happen and what time on this farm to enable us to prevent it? The same, the disease development process. I use the easy word and not pathogenesis for farmers. What do happen over time in this animal? Make it visible what happened and what signs would I see. So again, either in preventive medicine, herd health, and or biosecurity, we have to look very deep into a disease to see where do we target that disease for prevention. We have to understand the disease actually better than anybody else, because we don't just treat a sick disease according to symptoms. So there's just an example, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail into that. I see my time do have 10 minutes left. But the main thing is we have to decide when we do description of a disease, what approach can we use? Remember, we only had two tools. The one is to increase resistance, and the other one is to decrease exposure. So increase resistance, either general or specific. Decrease exposure, either decrease it or totally stop, prevent exposure. And again, when we look at the different diseases that we deal with, we can see something like bovine brucellosis that we spoke about quickly. For this disease, it's a slow development. There's very little to see. Even if we have the animal in quarantine on the farm, we won't see it if we don't test that animal. This specific disease, the only way in finding it out, apart from finding it in old cows at the abattoir, is testing for this disease. Luckily, to a very large extent, we have very few dairy herds in South Africa left that have a crisis with bovine tuberculosis, but we can never totally lift our guards. We don't have any vaccination in prevention, and we have also no clinical treatment. So this is a disease that's high on the priority list for biosecurity that must never get onto a clean farm. So our big crisis in the country is the control of brucellosis. There's a national biosecurity management. It's a priority. We have set up, and I've written this, and I take this slide out of a presentation to the dairy industry about 5 years ago. We had a whole disease management plan set up by the state. They call it South African Animal Health Plan. And the main focus was brucellosis. And everything was going to be focused on that. We still have the meetings, we still have trying to get it off the ground, but we're still at the discussion stage, 10, 20, nearly 30 years down the line. So it all just become discussions. Although we're quite lucky in our coastal grazing-based dairies that we have low incidence of the disease or prevalence of the disease. But with all the beef cattle, and that's what's very specifically happened, is beef cattle move from the infected areas to those areas they normally infect the dairy cattle in that area. And that's what happened in most of the outbreaks there. We basically have limited reporting of the disease right through the country. Here, I just show an example from that same presentation I made then, that suddenly the river maid stopped the disease, and we've seen very, very few cases of Brucella in the Free State. But that was not a real picture. That was just non-reporting. And for this disease, which is supposed to be, apart from foot and mouth disease, the single most important focus and reason for existence of the state veterinary services, we still have a major problem. Luckily, again, in dairy cattle, because we produce milk for human consumption, we have the yearly test and or on top of that, the milk rigging test. So if a veterinarian is involved on the farm and everything is done according to what needs to be done, then we can control Brucella as fast as possible when it gets onto the farm. This is just an overview that I've set up, and you'll see biosecurity there in the bottom, and it was built around brucellosis control in the country. And in actual fact, you need the whole system, the regional, the provincial, the national, disease control system with laboratories that's operational to get a turnaround time when you test a herd of 1 week maximum, because if you get a positive animal on a herd, that animal must get out of that herd within 1 week. It must get off the farm as quickly as possible. But at the end of the day, to control a disease like this, need the whole state system to work optimally. And that is where we're lacking. And that's why biosecurity at farm level become much more important. Much more important. But it's not something that is done or can be done without very specific methodology. I think there's too little veterinarians involved in setting up biosecurity plans for farmers. Again, I'm always coming back to our normal work as clinicians, where we get called out very easily for 2 animals dying and you do a post-mortem. But there's not enough veterinarians that spend 2 or 3 or 4 days during a year cycle, once a quarter, sitting down with the farmer, revisiting or setting up and revisiting the biosecurity measures that must be taken on that farm. Now, this specific action, this specific use of the veterinarian can save thousands, and in many cases millions of rands, by having your biosecurity done according to a very specific plan. And that plan include the identification of main risk in your specific area due to your specific circumstances on the farm. That is not something that is you just hear from the neighbor or from the guy at the co-op. That's a very specific thing, and it's time consuming, and it's part of the methodology, although the practice of doing it don't exist on many farms and in many practices. You have to rank and prioritize the main disease risks. There's a cost to everything. There's a cost to the loss. There's also a cost to the control. And you can't do everything at the highest level. Certain things you have to do at the highest level, other things you have to do just to manage it to get around. And that will depend on the disease. So one of the main things, and that's why I think vets need to spend 5 years, 6 years plus at university, is that we have to learn about the diseases, each disease, and the difference between diseases. Because my talk to the farmers always is there's not 2 diseases that's the same. If we look at the cause, the transmission, the disease development process, every single disease is different, and that's why every single disease need to be looked at, ranked, prioritized, and decide what actions need to be taken to prevent this specific disease. That's why we describe the disease in details. We have to find the strong points of the disease, and we have to find the weak points of the disease. If we look at one of the incredible reasons why brucella is such a risk, is this heifer calves born from positive cows that would test negative for the disease until or just before they calve for the first time. This Trojan horses. We make a big thing about BVD, but in brucella, one of our biggest single crises is heifers born from positive cows that don't show any positive test, seronegative until they get close to calving or just after calving. One of the major challenges in brucella control, and if you buy in cattle. So we have to describe the disease in detail, that we understand this disease as an intracellular organism. It can hide away in the lymph nodes. It actually multiply within our immune system cells. It only increase under certain circumstances in a pregnant animal, in a lactating animal. So you have to understand, and that's why you spend the time at university to learn this disease in detail when you come to disease prevention and or biosecurity plans. And then for each disease that's identified, you have to describe the disease prevention actions. There's no need to get to a farm and say, the first thing that you need to build is a dip, what do you call it, a food dip, where the cattle go, where the lorries go through when they get onto your farm. That is just general. You first have to identify what is your specific risks and say, this risk is coming into the farm through an animal, or this risk can come into the farm through feed, or this risk can come into the farm on a vehicle, or the dung on a vehicle, or on the tires. So when we get to, and that's my last concluding point, when we get to biosecurity on dairy farms, we have to be very specific about what do we want to control, and then develop the plan according to that, because there's so many things that we can't control that we must be very, very specific. And I hope in future more and more vets will be consulted on once a quarter basis for a whole day to set up the biosecurity plan, to monitor it, to make sure things is happening, because the biggest losses on a farm can be prevented by this, but currently there's very little need by farmers for paying the vet to precisely do this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Danie. We've got one question. What is the perfect age to vaccinate heifers with S19? The person said, maybe you already said it, but he had connection sound issues.
Yeah, I didn't go into the very specific details of each individual disease like brucella. We normally say after 4 months of age, 4 to 8 months of age. So for one, that the immune system is not totally, what's the English word? Too young still. So after 4 months of age, that's why we normally don't start earlier, but then after 8 months of age, we can have a problem with false positives whenever we test these animals when they're pregnant heifers or after their first calving. So we only have that window there, but having said that, I don't think that we've done in 30 years any work to say, can we vaccinate younger? Can we start at 3 months? Can we start at 2 months? How much of passive immunity is transmitted by the cow to the calf, or the heifer calf in this specific instance, and where's the best spot to do that? We just by tradition and according to the law use the 4 months to 8 months basically.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else would like to pose a question to Dr. Danie? You've got a thank you here van Gert Erasmus. Dr. Odendaal, apart from the representative state sought to implement in provincial level, what is the additional effort state could apply?
You'll have to repeat it. I couldn't hear it precisely.
Apart from the preventative state has sought to implement in provincial level, what is the additional effort the state could apply?
The state need to do surveillance. So one of the main functions of the state is to understand through surveillance, and that is randomly testing herds in different areas. Where do we stand with the disease? So that was something that was quite in place years ago. The most critical thing that happened in the last 30 years was that the budget for controlling these diseases have declined and declined and declined. To such an extent that we currently, most of the budget used, that I think is just under $1 billion, been used for salaries and very little for operational things. So the state need to have money to be able to test on a daily basis through a predetermined plan to understand the prevalence of the disease. The state previously also had some funding for herds to be tested on a regular basis. And I think that don't happen in most of the provinces. I think the Western Cape may be still the only province where there's money available for doing that. In most of the other provinces, all the testing is carried by the individual owner, farmer themselves.
Okay, his question then specifically referred to brucella.
Yeah, and I'm talking about brucella. Yeah. So the role of the state, the animal health technicians within the area, their role in surveillance, active surveillance of the disease, taking over control of positive herds, and until the disease is eradicated, it just don't happen anymore. Again, I don't want in the Western Cape can be the only difference, but in the rest of the country, unfortunately, I don't even nowadays contact the state vet. I inform him about the positive herd, but there's no help from that side to take over the control of that herd and test it on the state's budget until it's clean, because that's the function of the state for state-controlled disease.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Martin van der Leek. Want to say something?
Danie, we talk about internet entrepreneurs. Would you just talk about the uniqueness of vPlan and using the app and how people can join the effort?
Yeah, the disease reporting system was initiated by myself 10, 11 years ago when we had the outbreak with Rift Valley fever. At that stage, the disease was spreading throughout the country with us having no system in place to see how it's spreading and where it's going. Although there's not much you can do with Rift Valley as an insect transmissible disease in a total susceptible population where no vaccination was done before. So we set it up, and it's driven, especially in the last 5 years, by FAFA, which we are so glad, Dr. Malang, that he's out of hospital. And what's unique about it is that each veterinarian that's participating have built up a disease overview for his practice, like I've shown you on that one slide, which was never existed before. Before it was just the memory in your head, working from memory. Now we can very easily see what areas do have a problem with which disease. So veterinarians currently getting the app for free and participating, but then there's a number of practices that have joined veterinarian network as paying members, and for them we set up an electronic herd health plan for their clients, so they load all their clients on the system, and the vaccination plan we do it on an electronic basis and send out reminders on a monthly basis out to their clients. An automated system. After the veterinarian have set up the plan, we make it electronic and it send out the reminders on a monthly basis. That is the level that we are now. We want to go to the next level where we want to use the veterinarians or expand on the function of the veterinarians as the appointed herd health consultant when animals get sold, that it became a very specific status for a farmer to have a designated herd health veterinarian. And if he have that, he can join V-Plan, which is basically going to be a register of farmers that have a designated veterinarian with a herd health plan in place, which is revised once a year. That is our next, a simple step, but it's a major step actually forward.
Thanks, Danie. I'd like to talk some psychology, especially for our new graduates. How do you deal with people who say, I haven't seen Rift Valley fever in 5 years, so I'm not going to vaccinate?
I mean, if you want to talk psychology, then we're busy with a psychology experiment in the country, in the humans, and you can see that diverse meanings, opinions about vaccinating in humans. In livestock, we very used to vaccination. I mean, we use the number of antigens that we use on a yearly basis is more than 10, even in some adult animals. I do think that we can, it will help if we have an early warning system and or awareness program. The only way to deal with that is awareness. And we've seen how it worked through again, in the humans through the country. Awareness do work, and then we have to come back to the basics. Like I showed you in the first 1 or 2 slides, that when you sit with a naive population, there's nothing that you can do during an outbreak. But if you have animals that's been vaccinated, like in the dairy industry, as heifers at least once, before they are bred for the first time with the live vaccine, you will have lifelong memory cells in those animals. And even if it's cost prohibitive to vaccinate every year for Rift Valley fever that we only see in long cycles, every heifer that become a replacement in that herd will have memory cells. And one day when the disease come around and we have an early warning system, all those animals can get a booster dose without affecting their pregnancy status, because they won't go through that 2 weeks of developing immunity. They will call up the memory cells, and within 1 or 2 days, they will have some protection. And you can even use, in their case, then the inactivated vaccine. But I think it is case by case. In the case of Rift Valley fever, I just never want to have a herd that's naive. That is just totally irresponsible.
Thanks, Danie.
We do have a remark of another guest saying that if a vet in a certain area create epidemiology database of diseases that they diagnose on a monthly basis. That will also help to with the pattern of diseases and the occurrence thereof.
Who do that?
Now, if it's done, but maybe
Yes.
you can just tell them about Dr. Fafa's program.
And
Yeah,
that's what we do.
That's exactly what VNet does.
I discussed that already, Elena. That's precisely what we do with the disease reporting. It immediately gives you a electronic overview on a 12-month rolling basis for diseases occurring in your practice area or over the last 2 years, 5 years, as long as you have reported.
Another question? Okay, Dr. Danie, thank you for your presentation. Seems as though we don't have any other question. You do have some thank yous from some of our guests. And so from our side, thank you.